Hello, and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Again, another walk through the front lines on today, the 17th of October, 2022. And you might say not a lot of change in territory, but quite a bit to talk about because there's basically a battle of narratives going on, like I keep talking about. But actually, this is so the pro-Ukrainian sources aren't saying an awful lot because there's been media blackouts in certain areas, which means that the information is very, short on the ground. There's not a lot of word from official Ukrainian sources, and that means that the pro-Russian sources are able to sort of kind of flex their muscles and present their narrative. But actually, there are some worrying signs, perhaps. So, what happens when there's media blackouts is one of two things. So, the Ukrainians say that it is because there's something going on, right? They're making a big attack. So, let's take Kherson, for example, where there's been a lot of waiting for the last week or so after some really quick advances. There was some kind of culmination and a pause in attack, an operational pause. And this allowed critics to say, well, the Ukrainians have lost momentum and it's allowing the Russians to dig in, which is certainly what has happened, right? Whether it was necessarily the case that had to happen is up for debate. Whether that was a tactical decision that was poor or necessary, we might never know. So the Russians have dug in. Now, when there's a silence like this, Ukrainians are saying it's because something is happening. There's some big attack going on. We know that we think forces have been amassing in this area, Ukrainian forces, that is, and we know that the Russians are hemmed in here, unable to get supplies across the Dnipro River. So, is there operational security, OPSEC now? Is there a media blackout because the Ukrainians are doing something? The Russians, on the other hand, this is one of two ways this can be interpreted. The Russians say there's operational security when the Ukrainians are getting beaten, when they're losing a lot of troops. Now, we know there have been a couple of repelled attacks from the Ukrainians in Kherson, for example. And I'm going to return to Kherson later, but I'm just sort of talking about, narratives. The Russians are saying the Ukrainians are losing a lot of troops and armaments, and this is why there's this operational security. They've shut down, media reporting. They don't want any information to come out of here because things are bad, right? Is it so? The question is, whose narrative do you believe? Is it because things are happening, or because things aren't going very well for the Ukrainians that there is this kind of operational security? If we look at the big picture again, mobilized troops are really starting to come into these front lines, as far as I've been made aware, and they could be making something of a difference. As the Russians are digging in and getting their defensive line sorted, they are being padded out by the Russian mobilized troops, even though they might not be the best trained troops. This is what I was saying beforehand. They are boots on the ground, and for the time being, that is beneficial to the Russians, arguably. And we talked about the pros and cons before, whether like poorly trained troops are actually burdened on those frontline troops as they have to be trained. But if the Ukrainians are failing to make huge offensive movements, then actually these troops are able to be trained perhaps in the units up to a little bit of a better standard. The other thing to note is that the front line has been reduced in size over time, with about 400 kilometers less. So that means, and I talked about this down in Kherson, but that means that with a shorter front line, you are able to have more defenders per kilometer. So the Russians are able to arguably defend these lines better than they were with more troops, and they are receiving reinforcements. Let's look at Belarus. So I said that there's evidence that Russians are putting in some mobilized conscripts into Belarus. The question is, why are they doing that, considering Belarus are sending all their tanks and armament into Russia? One theory is that actually this western front here, bordering Poland, is an area that Belarus are quite afraid of. So if something big happens and Poland attack Belarus, they need some troops there. So the Belarusians have got a bunch of troops there. Could it be that the Russian conscripts are being piled in to do the kind of, it's probably not going to happen, but we ought to have some people defending this border. So they're getting the Russian troops, conscripts that aren't very well trained to defend this border, while the better trained Belarusian troops are, moving out and going into Russia to support Russia. That is one theory. Don't have any particular evidence for that, but it could be what's happening, because it's trying to make sense of why there are um, Russian mobilized conscripts in Belarus, but the armaments are not. Is it just this is a way to get them trained up as well? Can the Belarusians train up those conscripts to quicker than the Russians? That maybe the Russian training capabilities have been debilitated to such a degree that they're actually sending troops into Belarus to get trained. Anyway, those are the things that are going on there now. Overnight, there have been big attacks across Ukraine, particularly using Iranian kamikaze drones, and these are becoming something of well, they are a problem. They are a problem for Ukraine, because there are that many of them, and they are getting through. And even though Ukraine are shooting down a bunch of them, they are getting through. So if we look at, they can hit as far as Kyiv, right, which is the capital over here. So they are using drones. They're probably where they're firing these drones from, I don't know exactly, but there are some pretty scary pictures coming in from Kyiv and other places around Ukraine this morning. So they are trying to shoot them down with small fire, and they are hitting the capital city, causing a lot of damage, but also affecting the morale of those in Kyiv. We have evidence that things aren't looking too good in places like Kyiv. Zaporizhzhia is another place that gets hit quite a lot, and you get panic that comes with that, and that's exactly what the Russians want. Not only are they damaging infrastructure, and I don't know that a massive amount of infrastructure has been damaged overnight, but enough to cause real concern for the Ukrainians. Here is, the center of Kyiv. That's a kamikaze drone causing a not insignificant amount of damage, which is worrying. Here in Mykolaiv. So Mykolaiv is down near the Kherson front, and that has long been a target for the Russians in terms of cruise missiles, artillery at some points, and drones and all sorts. Anything they can fire at Mykolaiv tends to happen. And again, even though a bunch were shot down supposedly, at least one has got through and caused some damage to something. And here is an example. Whether this drone was actually taken out by small arms fire, I don't know, but this is the kind of stuff that's going on at the moment. So there's a drone around, and you can see the explosion of this drone. So there's a small arms fire.
Вон полетел. Где? Вон.
What's interesting with that is it blew up not after the small arms fire, so that may well have been taken out by an air defense missile system. That's what's happening, right, all the time at the moment. And again, I mean, we may see examples. I talk about misfiring missiles. So here is another Russian missile launched and falling apart. So things are happening now. What some people are saying, and people have been criticizing Israel for some time for not supporting Ukraine enough. Now, these Iranian drones, Israel and Iran obviously are not best of friends. So when Iran is successfully supplying Ukraine with all of these munitions, and now there is claims that they are starting to provide ballistic kind of cruise missiles. This is Iranian cruise missiles that are cheaper than the Russian ones and have about 100 meter CEP, so circle error probable. They've got an accuracy of about 100, which is better than some of the cruise missiles that Russia are using, although not as good as their best ones. But these are cheap, and if Iran are going to supply these, then Ukraine will be in for a tough time because they can make these relatively easily, not only cheaply, but they're using basically commercial parts to get around sanctions. So now some people are calling. So this morning it was reported, says Nachman Shai, was reported that Iran is transferring ballistic missiles to Russia. There is no longer any doubt where Israel should stand in this bloody conflict. The time has come for Ukraine to receive military aid as well, just as the USA and NATO countries provide. So this will be quite important. If Israel have a very advanced military, technological, industrial complex, and they can potentially support Ukraine with an awful lot where they haven't been already. So although I haven't done any frontline stuff yet, this is all really important because this is, this is still about places being hit in Ukraine and Russia putting a lot of pressure on these cities and pieces of infrastructure around Ukraine. Okay, let's get to the front lines finally for you. And we're going to go up to the Kupiansk down to Svatove and Kreminna. Basically, as far as I can work out, not a lot has changed. And this is partly because information is very sparse, and partly because really not a lot has happened. Russia are mounting counterattacks along these lines. So here is Donetsk and then Kreminna here. So around Kreminna, there is this old claim that's been going on that Russia control Terny, Torski, Dubrova. Again, some Russians are claiming to control Dubrova. So the question is, what's going on down here? Does it look like this? So Kreminna, and we've got the Cherobets River coming up here, or Cherobets River, going up north, and it's the Russians are claiming that they are definitely making counterattacks. Who occupies what in this area is open to debate, but it could be that this whole area is now a grey zone, really. Russia are definitely making counterattacks, but as according to Defmon here, those counterattacks are being repelled, and his line is pretty much where my line is there, but it's a bit of an unknown. Who owns what? Yeah. Going further north from there, I've not had much information again from yesterday. It seems a quiet day on the front. Nothing particular, or at least it won't be quiet. There'll be stuff happening, but there's very little information to give any acknowledgement of a change of territory. And as we come further down south between the Cherobets River here and the Krasny River, we've got Svatove up there. Yeah, we have not a lot of change of front lines and back down to here. So there you go. Let's move on to Bakhmut, and yet again, not a lot of change of front lines. It's all been about Opitny and Ivangrad. So if we look here, this is what I said yesterday, which is there's probably a grey zone near the Pitny and Ivangrad. Solidar, Bakhmutski, again, it's fighting going on there, and fighting to the south as they attempt to encircle both north and south, but no real change. And you could say the same for Donetsk in the Pisky area and Avdivka. So sorry, I was going to go into Kherson, but again, fighting going on around Avdivka as they try and encircle that, and moving out from Pisky to help do that larger encirclement. But again, it's a matter of meters that the Russians are taking, if that, each day. Not a lot. Usual sort of stuff on Zaporizhzhia front line. Not a lot going on, although there will be exchanges happening and a few fights here and there. So really, we're going to Kherson, and like I said earlier, there is no news out from here. And with a media blackout, that is telling you either one, that Ukraine are in the midst of doing something or just about to do something really big, or they have been doing some big things and the Russians have repelled them and it's not going well for the Ukrainians. What I'm fairly confident at the moment is that Ukrainians are making losses. There's another report that they've lost another jet around here. Again, this is coming from the Russians, a Su-24, I think. But these claims of the Russians, again, is that propaganda? I'm fairly sure Ukrainians have taken some casualties on this northeastern Kherson front line, and things aren't going as smoothly as they were a couple of weeks ago. But whether they're just trying to probe and soften up for a larger offensive, that's what the Ukrainians, that's what it seems to be the case, but nothing yet tells me that that is actually happening. But maybe today is the day, and we'll hear some news after today. I don't know. Now, here is the difference in narratives concerning what's going on in Kherson. So this is what I said the other day. Here's the front line going from Milove across to Sukhanove, Borozhensky, across then Bruskinski, and then hitting the Inhulets River. Okay, that's what I've been saying for a few days. And then yesterday I said, actually, the Russians are now claiming that they are in control of some settlements northeast of Milove towards Dushani. So I then said, okay, this could well be grey area because there's a lot of people saying that this is the case. Ukrainians aren't really saying anything. And then basically today, there's claims that actually really they're fighting in the south of Duchany. Now, again, this is from pro-Russian sources because the Ukrainians are saying nothing. So all the information is coming from the pro-Russians. Now, the Ukrainians have said a couple of things, that they made an attack down to Tamarini and then a little sort of attack down here, or at least there's fighting being reported there. But officially speaking, the Ukrainians are basically saying nothing. So the Russians are then saying, well, actually, we're fighting the south of Duchany, and we're attacking towards Novokamianka, and we control kind of this area. So you've got the Ukrainians saying we control this area, and the Russians saying actually we control north of there now, Suki Stavok, almost towards Davidov Brid again, and then sort of joining the Inhulets River there. So you've got these competing narratives, and who is correct? Who knows? I mean, there appears to be fighting certainly around here. So I think at the very least, this is probably just a big fat grey zone here, and there'll be backs and forwards until someone makes a big offensive. And part of the threats to the Ukrainians, and part of the issue they have, is that from the left bank of the Dnipro River, the Russians can hit them with artillery and even grads. So they can be sort of pummeled here from this whole area of Russian occupied territory. Obviously, Ukrainians can hit them back, but actually the Russians just have traditionally had far more capacity in terms of artillery. You just have loads more of it and a bunch of ammunition, and of course here they can be supplied okay. It's this area where they are lacking in supplies. So if they can hammer this area with artillery from across the river, then it gives the Russian infantry and mechanized sort of units a chance to claw back some land. So that could well be, well, it appears that is what is certainly happening to some degree. Are the Russians capable of making an offensive? I mean, they've got the troops down there, but do they have the supplies, and do they have the morale and the wherewithal to make an actual offensive to gain back some of this line? Or are we just waiting for this big promised Ukrainian offensive? Given that they have made a couple of larger attacks in the last few days, and those have been repelled, and it seems like the Ukrainians have lost a good deal of capability there. But I don't know. It's just a whole load of unknowns. It's not looking great for Ukraine in terms of the pressure they are getting from both cruise missiles and drones, and the idea that Iran are supporting more and more the Russian attacks. The Russians are filling up the lines with mobilized troops. The Ukrainians haven't made any further advances, and the operational pause, is that a culmination, or do they have the numbers and the capability to punch holes either up here, down in Kherson, or, as some people have been saying for some time, in the Zaporizhia area or the southern Donetsk area? Don't know. There's just not a lot of information. Anyway, there you go. Sorry, not particularly useful, but check out my Ukraine War Update Extra video later that will come out and give you the juicy nuggets and the things that might be of interest to you. You can always support my channel through Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, YouTube thanks, all those kind of things. And I do really appreciate that. Thank you, because this is kind of like half my job. UAsupporter.com/ATP if you fancy getting yourself some Ukrainian merchandise. If you are pro-Ukrainian, you're pro-Russian, it's kind of less appealing, I guess. But there you go. But if you are pro-Ukrainian, there's a whole bunch of let's look at some mouse mats and phone cases uh, and other things. AirPods case. Goodness me, what you can do these days. Map of Ukraine iPhone case. So help yourself, guys, and I get a little cut in a little commission there if you do decide to do that. Thank you very much. Anyway, toodle pips, and I'll see you later.